Welcome to In the Oil Patch, presented by SHALE Oil and Gas Business Magazine and sponsored by Steer. In the Oil Patch is where together we learn and explore topics that affect us all in oil and gas, business, and in your community. Every week, our host Kim Bellotto, along with me, Alvin Bailey, will visit with the movers and shakers in this fast-paced industry. You'll hear from industry experts, elected officials, and many more right here on In the Oil Patch.
And you are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. And today we actually have a very special guest on the line. His name is Tom Mullikin. Tom, welcome to In the Oil Patch Radio Show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Now, Tom, before we get started, because I have a lot of questions for you being an environmental attorney, I want to start off by asking you a couple of questions. Tell us who you are. How did you fall into being an environmentalist attorney, and where are you located at?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. I got started in the environment about 1980. I had an opportunity to work on Capitol Hill for the NOAA subcommittee of the United States Senate Commerce Committee. And at the time, I was at the University of South Carolina, majoring in biology, and I really just fell in love with environmental issues. It's something that I had grown up with, being in the outdoors in the Southeast. That's just kind of the culture here, hunting and fishing and being on the river systems and out in the ocean. And I decided to leave my goal of going to medical school after completing pre-med and going to law school. And shortly after law school, if you can believe it, I had given some of my views now, I should say. I worked for then a young United States Senator named Al Gore. And it was working on Gore's staff that I first started focusing on issues such as global climate change, and began what would become a corporate law, energy, and environmental law practice.
Very interesting, especially when we'll get into Al Gore here shortly. So, as an environmental attorney, you've been quoted as saying that the U.S. energy production is one of the greatest developments for our global environment. So how can that be true?
This is where I think a sometimes uninformed or even misinformed public fails to put a couple of the pieces together. And let me say that what would be the very best outcome for the global environment is having manufacturing take place in the United States. Because if you look at atmospheric emissions from man, anthropogenic interference, you see that most of those are coming from either smokestack or tailpipe. And the reason why we've seen millions of manufacturing jobs leave the United States for places like China is because of the cost of energy and the availability of energy. And so when you look at those jobs leaving the United States, you really begin to look at the worst case scenario, not just for the United States, but also for the global environment. We lose those jobs. In the case of manufacturing jobs, around 6 million manufacturing jobs over the last little more than a decade. So we lose those jobs. We lose the investment. And when we send those emissions in those manufacturing facilities to China, we not only increase greenhouse gas emissions, but we increase the so-called, what I call the silent killers. One of the largest emitters of ambient mercury in the United States today is China. One of the largest emitters of things like smog indicators in the West Coast is China. And when we begin to look at how moving these emissions and moving these jobs has impacted our global economy, we begin to pull that back, and we realize that one of the major issues in moving those jobs is a lack of available and less costly energy sources. These companies that are leaving 400 or 500 jobs at a time, so-called energy intensives, may be paying anywhere from $6 to $8 million a month in energy. So that as we have kept ourselves from becoming more energy secure, we've also had a major impact in increasing global greenhouse gas and other listed pollutants.
Well, and you know, Tom, you bring up a good point as far as looking at other countries and My thought has always been, my belief, that the United States not only develops great technology when we do create the technology, and specifically in energy, we're always going to be looking for the greener way of doing it. And not all countries do that. It is the cheapest, the fastest, and who cares about the environment? And China is one of those countries that is not necessarily looking for the benefit of mankind. They're looking and how it fits into global warming, if you will, or the changing of the environment. It's basically going to develop to enhance their country. And so that being said, it's an interesting point when we look at how the United States has been consistently for the last 8 years under assault from the Obama administration with all of the different ruling and regulation. And yet it's very hard to understand why, if it's such an important thing, and it is to do, then why are other countries not being penalized or forced into some capacity to develop more greener ways of developing energy?
Well, and you'll hear the same folks say that the United States had a major impact during its years of industrial development. But we also didn't have the technologies that are available today, and we didn't have the standards that we have today. So those really, when you peel back those kinds of statements and arguments, they just fall flat. And when you look at very credible studies by the National Academy of Sciences and others, you realize just what a terrible impact moving these manufacturing facilities to China and other parts of the Pacific South have done. I mean, as much as 24% of the sulfate-based air pollution over the western U.S. today is generated in China. You look at these other pollutants. We've gotten the exact opposite of what we wanted.
I couldn't agree with you more, Tom. We're going to take a real quick break. When we return, we're going to pick this conversation back up, and you are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. And you are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest is Tom Mullikin with Mullikin Attorney at Law. Tom, before the break, we were talking about the reverse effect of seeing all of our manufacturing energy type of jobs leaving into other countries, specifically China, the impact that it has created through the environment. What are some of the recommendations that you can see? Like, I know you say host community support is critical to the energy industry development. Why is this the case?
It's critical for a couple of reasons. I've done a fair amount of research on the development of environmental standards, and what I can tell you going back to Greco-Roman days is that those standards have been enacted in response to public concerns. And you see what is going on is environmental issues at 30,000 feet are very complicated, very technical issues, and they're debated among very smart people, and that goes on. But at the local level, environmental issues are health issues. I don't want my water polluted there. I don't want to choke on dirty air. And these become kind of dinner table conversations, and they're very emotional. And where the energy industry has failed to acknowledge and to address these issues in host communities, those folks who want to shut down development of domestic energy sources have taken advantage of that. And that's not just in the United States, that's around the world. And what I can tell you from having done work on every continent is that a person will not sell their environment for a job. It won't work at that level. In the 80s and 90s, we talked about it, NIMBY, not in my backyard. And it's developed into more aggressive, almost to the point where we're seeing eco-terrorism in these local communities or advocacy by ambush on local communities. And you will see more of that now. I think that people think that with the change in administration, many of these issues will go away. They won't go away. They'll just become more localized. So it is vitally important.
But doesn't it seem, Tom, though, when you look at it from, an outsider looking in, so you have all these environmental concerns coming from other countries. Part of it has been self-inflicted in us allowing manufacturing jobs to go to these other countries that don't really enforce or reinforce greener ways of doing it. And so now it's causing an effect worldwide, including the United States. And yet these green environmental companies take full advantage of suing the United States government consistently.
While I worked for then Senator Gore when I was in my 20s, he and I both speak about the environment, but our proposed political solutions couldn't be more different. The name of his documentary is The Inconvenient Truth. The name of my documentary is The Whole Truth. So let me focus on the slice of climate change, and tell you very quickly that this issue was first formalized in 1992 at the Earth Summit down in Rio, where they then framed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And at that time, the exact language was to pull in all of the nations on Earth to create a solution. 5 years later, the UN went to Kyoto, Japan, and it crafted what became the defining instrument for this for the next 10, 20 years, called the Kyoto Protocol. This is an important point. This was an instrument that was going to begin to harness all the world's emissions and begin seeking lowering those greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so what was little reported, what you read about was there would be required reductions by the developed nations and really just reporting opportunities for the undeveloped nations. People read about this for decades. But what they didn't know was that in that list of undeveloped nations or developing nations was China, which is the number one emitter of greenhouse gases today, India, Brazil, and at that time, nearly 50% of the world's emissions were written out of that protocol. Today, it's more than half. Okay.
There you go. And Tom, we've got to take a quick break. You are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. And you are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest is Tom Mullikin with Mullikin Attorney at Law. Tom, before the break, we were discussing two movies that were, one was put together or created by you and the other one by Vice President Al Gore. And you were discussing before the break a very interesting topic. Let's get back on that topic. You were discussing how a lot of the biggest actors in providing the biggest air emissions on the planet were written out of a plan, the Kyoto Protocol. What specifically is that?
The Kyoto Protocol was the document that was framed as the follow-up to the Earth Summit that began to identify totals of global emission and then seek reductions. And on the day it was first framed, a little more than 48% of the Earth's emissions were written out. And Kim, just to be clear, I hope you're sitting down because I'm going to give you a real lightning bolt here. There's only one atmosphere, okay?
Right.
And I say that because if what we're doing here is increasing emissions over there, we haven't addressed this issue. Do you follow? Because if it's more over there than it would be over here, and global emissions have gone up, and that's what you're here to talk about, you're working in the wrong direction. And what has happened is that the United States has stayed largely stagnant with slight reductions that have been associated mostly with the downturn at the time of the economy. But global emissions have continued to skyrocket. And the reason for that is this huge, like nearly 200% increase in China's emissions and other countries that were not captured by the Kyoto Protocol. And that's on greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where I go back to talking about when we've moved these emissions to China and other so-called undeveloped nations, because of the westerlies, the winds that can carry these pollutants, we've seen dangerous spikes and increase in other contaminants like mercury. So that what the public has gotten has largely been fragmented information that's been used to drive to a political solution, not an environmental solution. And I think that is very important. And so, case in point, I was invited several years ago to go to Minnesota. When I got up there, I thought I was speaking about climate when I got into northern Minnesota. It really was about whether or not to reopen a steel manufacturing plant. And it had been largely reported that 5 million metric ton footprint for that facility, well, the Minnesotans at that time, many in that area didn't want it, many did want it. But this really captures this conversation. The locals said, we don't want the 5 million metric ton footprint, okay? And then when I say local, environmentalists said that. On the other side of the room, literally, were folks, the rangers in that area, who wanted the investment and wanted the job. So we now got jobs, we got investment, and we have an environmental issue. About 4 hours into this 45-minute presentation, I asked the side that didn't want the emissions. I said, if we don't get these emissions, if we decide that we're not going to open this plant here, do you think this plant will open somewhere? And they said yes. And I said, where? And they said, well, given all you've said, probably China. And I said, okay, well, what's going to happen then? This, too, is a very important point. Well, they'll have that 5 million metric ton footprint. I said, well, no, that's not exactly right. The world will have that 5 million, but over in China, it won't be 5 million. It'll be 15 million, because the most conservative number I've seen on carbon intensity is not 1 for 1 for reasons that we can talk about, but 3 to 1, 3 to 5 to 1. So we're going to take that 5 million metric ton footprint for that manufacturing operation. We're going to send it to China. We're going to get global emissions of 15 million metric tons. We're going to get operations that are not as clean, and the western United States is going to be choking on more particulate matter, more sulfates, more mercury, and the world is going to be dealing with more greenhouse gas emissions. That's exactly what has happened. That right there, that story has been told over and over again, where we have moved. And that brings you back to energy. So, aside from the environmental standards that the government has continued to impose, if we don't have a reliable and affordable source for domestic energy, we're going to see more of that happening.
Exactly. And, the other really crucial part of this component, and thank you for explaining it in a way that we can all understand, is the other component, which is, okay, so if the United States is shipping off all of our energy needs to other countries that really are not promoting, looking out for the best interest of the world pertaining to the environment, there's also another underlying area here, which is the U.S.'s energy security. It's an important factor for the United States for us to consider when we are energy independent. This also helps us with our national security issues. So tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Well, that's another piece that involves putting a couple of the dots together, so that we, through the shale revolution, we have an opportunity to really put ourselves in a position of energy independence, energy security. Each year, we're spending somewhere a little north of $380 billion to import our energy sources. About $50 billion of that, and that's a conservative number, is going to countries who are actively opposed to our national security. Now, when you look at that, if you look at history a little bit, you go back as recent as 1969, and I'm going to walk through this slowly. In 1969, only about 15% of the world's oil reserves were owned by state-owned or controlled companies, okay? Iraq, Iran. Today, it's a little more than 80%. So we're not just buying this from the corner bookstore, right? We're buying this from nation states who have stated objections to our national security. Somewhere in the neighborhood of between $50 to $380 billion a year. That money is then being converted into military weaponry and is being used to shoot back at us. So this is just simply telling that story from statistics that are readily available. So those that would say that energy security and national security are not the exact same thing really need to take another look. We need to have an energy policy in this country that has integrity for this country.
Exactly. And you know what, Tom? I need to take a quick break, but I'm going to just end before we go into break of saying, Donald Trump, when he was running wanting to run for president, he was basically talking about how important energy was and the shale revolution to helping us get to being energy independent and, of course, increasing our national security as a nation. When we get back, I want to get back on topic on that. You are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. And you are listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest is Tom Mullikin with Mullikin Attorney at Law. Tom, before the break, we were talking about the importance of the United States continuing to engage in what I call the shale renaissance, because we have been able through technology now to access resources that we never could before. And so the United States is directly on a path for energy independence, which also, I believe, equates to a really important topic, which is the United States no longer being dependent on foreign oil. And that is a real potential possibility. But I want to dig in further to help our listeners understand. There's a lot when you think about energy. It's a very complex topic. There are many different topics that come into this conversation: security, energy, environment, all kinds of things. You have stated that without energy production in the United States, the economy will decline, global pollution will increase, and the American national security will weaken. What and why do you say this?
I've called that trifecta of doom because of the reasons we've spoken about today. When we don't have plentiful and affordable energy sources, we're going to lose manufacturing. And when we lose manufacturing, we're going to lose jobs across this country, just like we have over the last decade, where we've lost more than 5 million manufacturing jobs. When our manufacturing moves to countries that don't have the same level of environmental protection and or scant enforcement, we're going to see the increase, which we've seen and we've witnessed, increase of greenhouse gases and other listed pollutants, which is going to negatively impact our environment and our health directly, where we've seen the westerlies bring Chinese pollution to our shores on the West Coast. And finally, we're going to see a much more difficult geopolitical situation where we're relying on our energy sources from stated opponents of our national security. Now we're spending about $380 billion on importing sources, and the shale revolution will allow us to reduce and hopefully eliminate our energy needs from those countries who've stated their opposition to our national security. And so let me just say this. There are those that would have you believe that you have to pick either protecting your environment or protecting your economy. And that's sort of the polarized way that the popular media deals with this issue. That is a bogus place to start. It also requires a much more thoughtful and sophisticated approach, but we absolutely can have environmental sustainability and economic sustainability. And let me add that if you have proposed environmental solutions that are not economically sustainable, that's a fad. That's not a solution. And that's what we've seen where people have tried to push technologies into the marketplace that haven't matured. I'll tell you this because you're in Texas, a fact that I'm sure you're aware of, that few people around the country are aware of, and that is when you look at who has the greatest amount of electricity production, far and away the state. If you ask this question on the street corner survey around the country, who has the greatest amount of renewable energy production, I'm sure people would start with California, perhaps Massachusetts or the state of Washington, but far and away the greatest production is in Texas. And it's also where you've had the greatest amount of positive economic activity with the CREZ project and the solar and geothermal. What you've seen is that energy companies have seized opportunities to bring developing technology like hydraulic fracturing to the marketplace, and it has been a world leader. We need to avoid that trifecta of doom by creating energy security here in the United States and using that to drive economic activity, to drive a cleaner environment, and to ensure greater national security.
Well, Tom, what a great ending to the segment. For more information for our listeners to get a hold of you if they have more questions on the environment or looking for an environmental attorney, give us your information of where they can contact you.
It's Tom Mullikin at the Mullikin Law Firm, Mullikin. I can be found on the internet on our website at mullikinlaw.com, or I can be contacted at 803-425-7771.
And on our podcast, after it airs, we put it on shalemag.com, and our listeners can go and get more information from our website on you. That's all the time we have today, folks. Tom, it was a pleasure having you on the show today, and we look forward to you coming back and talking to us more about the environment.
Well, Kim, great talk with Tom Mullikin today. He's, he wrote a great article for Shale Oil and Gas Business Magazine.
He sure did, talking about a topic that we should all know more about. Absolutely,
and we're going to make that the topic of our trivia question this week. Hey, write down this email address. It's radio@shalemag.com. Again, radio@shale, SHALE, mag, MAG.com. And if you're the first correct emailer with the correct answer to this trivia question, you'll win a $75 gift certificate to
Fogo de Chao.
Great Brazilian steakhouse.
Amazing.
Love Fogo de Chao. Here's the question. Are you ready? Everybody ready? You in the back, you ready? Okay, everybody's ready. Here's the question. What was the title of Tom Mullikin's article that he wrote for Shale Oil and Gas Business Magazine? Be the first correct emailer to radio@shalemag.com, and you'll win a $75 gift certificate to Fogo de Chao. Kim, that's going to wrap it for this week. Been a great show.
It was. It went so fast.
A lot of
amazing
fun.
Guest.
Amazing guest. Tom is an amazing attorney. If you get a chance, look him up. He's just a really great guy, really great attorney, and he covers such a large gamut of different things as an attorney.
Another one of our energy experts. I would agree.
Hey, until next week, be sure and like us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/In the Oil Patch Radio Show. On Twitter @ShaleMag. And until next week,
adios.